This is Bernice Jackson interviewing Raymond Phillips of May, Oklahoma, October the 3rd, 1986. Raymond, tell me when and where were you born?
I was born on the 26th day of September, 1909, about 4 miles south of May, Oklahoma.
And who were your parents?
Joe Phillips and Maud Phillips.
Maud, what's her maiden name?
Her name was Maud Wilson.
Maud Wilson.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me something about your father's people?
Yes, my father's people. My father was Bill Phillips, and he lived in Kansas City for quite a while. And my father went to school in Kansas City.
Is that where he was born?
He was born in Missouri, but he was born, I think, near Chillicothe, Missouri. But he later moved to Kansas City with my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And my father then, he came to Oklahoma. My grandfather came and settled on 1,900 and filed on 160 acres.
And what was your grandfather's name?
Bill Phillips.
Bill Phillips.
Yes, William Ralph Phillips, they called him Bill.
Mm-hmm.
And he filed on this land. He went back to Kansas City. Then he sent my father and his daughter, which married Frank Roberts, down to prove up the place. And he had a 2-room sod house built down there. Then my father and they came down on the first day of March, 1901, and landed at Gage. They had horses, they had mules, they had jacks, they had 3 or 4 days moving to get it all out there to the place.
How did they come here?
They came by train to Gage,
mm-hmm.
and then they had to unload, put their stuff in the stockyards a while, and then they moved it on out
mm-hmm.
to where they live now.
Mm-hmm. That was your father? That
That was my father, Joe
mm-hmm.
Phillips.
Mm-hmm.
His really name was Orley Ray Phillips, but he went by the name of Joe Phillips, and he also done business by the name of Joe Phillips and Orley Ray both.
Oh?
He did.
He had dual
But his
names.
sister gave him the name of Joe, and nobody ever, but he went with that.
Mm-hmm.
And he served on the school board at May for 22 years.
Your father did?
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
He was also the superintendent of the Methodist Sunday School in May for about 21 or 22 years.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother also took care of all the finance in the Methodist Sunday School at May in the church, bought all the Sunday school literature, and they was there till they got so old they couldn't operate it.
What kind of a house did they live in?
My father, when he came, my granddad came down, and there was a man by the name of Smith, and he'd been in the Civil War, and he was on the north side, on the blue,
mm-hmm.
and they shot his left arm off, and at the elbow. And he had a 2-room sod house built there, and he told my grandfather, he said, this place isn't fit for a dog to live in down there in this country. And my granddad says, what do you want for your 160 acres you've proved up? He said, you give me $1,000, Bill, for it, and I'll get out of here. Bill said, you've got your $1,000, just sign it over to me, and they signed it over to him. My father built another room on the north of the old sod house, and I was born in that sod house.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a wonderful kitchen. It was plastered with cleachy. And my mother put beautiful wallpaper on it because she papered it with newspaper.
Well, now, this room they built on, it was made out of sod.
Sod the same way with an old oval roof on it, and the roof was covered with dirt, and she has a picture of it. And me is standing by my little baby buggy, and I was just a little old blonde-headed kid about 2 years old. And she's got the picture my daughter has.
Uh-huh. All right, and was any of the ground broke out?
No, not at that time. There wasn't on that
Right.
place.
How did your father manage then?
Well,
Or your grandfather?
all the horses they sent out, my grandfather told my dad, he said, you better leave some of this land for pasture. So there's 40 acres, and I'm still using it for horse pasture. Mm-hmm. And he broke the rest of it out, which is 107 acres. But On the east side of it, there's a big spring of water, and we couldn't farm that, so we just left that out. And that was the best place my granddad ever bought, because I've got one well on it that's just 7 foot to water. I've got another well on it that's 21 foot to water, and I really don't need, only over on the spring it runs the year round, and I can just water all kinds of cattle. And just think of that, Bernice, just $1,000 for 160 acres of land.
But that was back in 1901.
That was right. And the man said it wasn't fit for a dog to live out there, and I commenced thinking maybe sometime he was right in the 30s.
Oh, we'll get to that pretty soon. All right, tell me about your mother's people.
My granddad, he was a carpenter, and he was working back.
And his name was?
Jack Wilson, John T. Wilson, they call him.
John T. Wilson.
But my grandmother and my mother and the children came to Gage on a train with her brother, Frank Wasson, which today was Bobby Wasson down here that runs this here trailer court, was his grandfather.
Oh.
And they came out, and my grandfather he'd already came out ahead of them, and he said, we're getting out of this hole. He said, we're not staying. But he'd built a sod house. My grandmother said, we're going back where you built the sod house. So they went back, and they stayed it out. And my grandfather done he was a carpenter. Now, my grandfather was the father of Lee E. Wilson, who done all the big contracting work in Woodward, Oklahoma.
Oh.
Yes, Lee, he learned a lot of that carpenter work from his father, my grandfather Wilson. And my mother, she got a job working in the first store that was ever in May, Oklahoma, on the banks of Otter Creek. It was built by a man named Russell. And I think she said she was 17 or 18 years old, and she went out there and went to working in that store for Mr. Russell.
What wages did she get?
I think, my God, I think you give her board, and I think she's getting $3 a week. My God, I'll tell you, you're allowed to get rich that kind of work. But I think that's what she said she got.
Back in 1903, wasn't
it? Yeah, and Amy Petty's mother, which was named then, she married Dan Harris, and those two girls both worked in that store.
And that was the first store.
First store was ever in May. In fact, there wasn't no town of May then. It was just this old man Russell's store on the Otter Creek bank on the east side of Otter Creek. It's just west of where John Bagger's house now stands in May.
That Otter Creek, is that the one that goes?
Right against May, just you cross May, going west out of May. That's East Otter. But West Otter empties into East Otter out there at Bernarian's place.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, but that town, that thing 2 times now has flooded the town of May. Terrible.
Well, okay. Now then, let's get back to the farm. And how did your father break the sod out? Can you tell me how he managed?
He had 2 sod plows. And he hired, when he started out, he hired a boy named Wilbur Houston, which was Mrs. Jim Dudley. Everybody knew Mrs. Dudley in May, everybody, the Dudley boy. His Wilbur came and worked for Dad, and they'd take 2 horses hooked to a sod plow. In fact, the matter, Dad had 3 sod plows. Granddad sent them down there, and they broke this land out, and they worked it. And Wilbur worked for Dad for about, I guess 4 or 5 years. He went to New Jersey, and he'd write to Dad, but he disappeared. Nobody ever knew whatever happened to him.
Describe a sod plow for me.
All right. You can set a sod plow. Did you ever see one?
I've run them.
You've run them?
Yeah.
You'll say I'm right. You can set a sod plow to plow any depth you want to, isn't that right, Ray? But you plow, say you're going to plow 6 or 7 inches to the ground. Then you have your long iron rods that it lays that sod over. And if you want to raise it, you raise it by your beam with your horses. And my daddy, I don't know, I kept that sod plow in an old barn, it disappeared, one of them for a long while. And then they would disc it. And my dad said the first wheat crop he ever raised on this place, he said, I don't know how we ever done it, but he said it was a wonderful crop on new soil.
Do you remember him saying how much it made?
No, I don't remember. But she's got the picture of my father standing on a header with Shorty Walson and 2 or 3 other young fellas. And my granddad come down for the harvest. He had on a straw hat. But he didn't look really right in that straw hat after he'd come out of Kansas City.
Oh, he didn't?
No, he didn't.
Oh, one of those fancy straw hats.
No, he was kind of a tilted dude.
Oh, he was. And that looked out of place out here.
It did in that time, but later on he kind of got naturalized to the company, and he wore overalls, and he could work.
Okay. Now, what was your job around the farm?
Oh, my
when
Lord.
You were a little boy?
I went to school. I walked to school.
What school
2
did you
miles.
go to?
Fairview, 2 miles north of Mara. Bernie Rush now lives on that place.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd get home. Dad would say, my father was always busy.
Mm-hmm.
You get the wood. You get the coal in. You get them cows in, kid. And you be milking them cows. And if I ain't here, you just keep right on going. And
how old were you about that?
Oh, I was about 7, 8 years old from then on up. And if there's anything Mother wanted to do, I had to kind of get along with that too.
Oh.
I promise you, Bernice, they always kept me busy. They didn't let me have any time off.
Well, that kept you out of trouble, didn't it?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. What kind of building was this schoolhouse? Was it sod?
No, it was a big frame building called Fairview.
And
I judge it was about, that building was about 50 foot long, and I'll say it was about 35, 40 foot wide. It was a big building. But when I started there, Mrs. Spogey was our teacher, and she lived in May. And I thought she was a wonderful teacher. I'll tell you why I thought so much of her. Every morning, whenever we opened up school, she had a prayer, and we had a song. And that was the way they should start school today. Am I right or wrong?
I think you're right.
And she was really a strict teacher, but I really loved her. She was a good woman.
And how long did you go there to that school?
I went there till I was in the 5th grade, and then they consolidated that school into May, and we rode an old Model T truck in there. And that was just about like riding a lumber wagon. It'd bounce along, and all they had was a flap over to keep you from freezing to death, and your feet would get cold. Back to Monday, you got cold all over.
How many miles was that?
Well, I rode it 4 miles, but the good heavens, it would go around quite a ways, and it would get stuck all the time.
Oh.
I seen 2 old wore-out mules had more power than that old Model T truck had. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And Al Strait drove it. He was the first truck driver ever in that country when they consolidated. And then they had a school south bus called Bonella, and Al Price drove it, and he was from May, and he had one built just like it.
And where did you go to high school at?
May.
At May. Did you graduate there?
No, I couldn't graduate.
You couldn't.
I had everything on my mind but school.
How much schooling did you get?
I got to 11th grade and told the teacher so long. I thought she was a wonderful person. And she pretty near cried, and my sister, she was there, and she met me outside the door, and she said, "You're doing the wrong thing." I said, "I don't think I have to have any kid to tell me whether I'm doing right or wrong." I went home, and my grandfather was there, and he said, "Kid, I knew you was coming back, but I got started late in school, and we just kept on raising cattle and raising wheat." And my education didn't get too high. I learned more out of school than I ever did in school.
Yes, I imagine so. Okay, then you went farming with your father, did you?
I sure did. And my grandfather, but when my grandfather died.
Now, which one of your grandfathers?
Granddad Phillips. Him and my father, they farmed together.
I see.
And they had thrash machines and horses, my lord, and mules. You never saw anything like it, what we had. We had quite an outfit down there.
Then what became of Grandpa Wilson?
Well, sir, Grandfather Wilson, he stayed there, and he farmed, and he done a lot of carpenter work. And him and his brother-in-law built my father's house they lived in, was 4 rooms and a pantry on it. And Dad said I paid the carpenter and all the expenses for that house for $800, and I just couldn't hardly believe it.
Oh, I do.
That is exactly what and that was the truth if Dad said it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he carpentered all over the country. My grandfather Wilson did. He was a good carpenter.
He didn't farm that much. He did.
He only had 160 acres,
mm-hmm.
and he wouldn't milk a cow at all. That was out of his line of business. The kids had to milk the cows.
Oh.
Yeah, he'd put up a little feed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he built half the town of May. He'd walk up there in the morning and walk home at night.
Mm-hmm.
And he built a lot of houses in May.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go back now and tell me about May.
May.
This first store, where was it located? Was it in the town of May now? What?
Now, it was at that time, nobody owned any land in May. You could go out and set out a claim, see what I mean? You could set out a little claim there, and Mr. Russell put him a claim in there, and he put the store there. Mm-hmm. Now, where Ray Ishmael lives today in the town of May, that was Dr. McLeod's office, Dr. McLeod, and he was the doctor that brought me into this world.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother worked later. Dr. McLeod's wife got sick, and my mother he went to old man Russell and asked him if one of the girls could come and help him. And Mr. Russell asked the girls, and my mother said, well, she said, I'll go help Doctor. Mm-hmm. And she would take care of Doctor, and she died. And she's buried in the May Cemetery. And her name before she married Dr. McLeod was Wilson. Old man Wilson had a drugstore in May. Mm-hmm. And he had two boys, Roy and Harry, and this girl. Mm-hmm. And he had two children, and Vera McLeod and Sherbin McLeod. But he sent Sherbin off to college. And he wasn't gone but about 7 or 8 months. The dean of the college, someplace in Missouri, they got in touch with Dr. McLeod and said, we're sending your boy back home. He said, we can't handle him in this school. But, no, I'm ahead of myself. Doctor left and went to Tyrone. That's where he sent Sherbin back. And he said, it hurt me so bad. When the boy walked in the door, I said, I knew he was coming. He said, well, what are you doing home? Well, he said, they kicked me out of college. Well, he said, I'm glad they did. You wasn't doing any good. Now I said, go get your clothes in there, of your clothes, and get them and get out. And he said, the boy went in, he got his clothes, and he wrapped them up. Katie, at that time, there was a railroad went down along he moved out at Tyrone. That's where it was. Mm-hmm. He said, I watched the boy walk down the railroad track. And he said, I didn't know where he was going or what was going to happen, but he said, I thought maybe to put some brains in his head. And he said, I went back and sat down, and he said, I cried all day and all night. But he said that it wasn't long till he went to Wichita, Kansas, and he got in with another doctor, an old man. And this doctor wrote to Dr. McLeod, and he said, Doctor, you keep that boy, and you let me know if you need any money. He said, I want you to push that boy. Now, my brother-in-law, Keith Harvey, lives in Wichita, Kansas today. Mm-hmm. He knew Dr. Sherbin McLeod. He said he is the greatest surgeon there ever was in Wichita. He's dead now. But Dr. McLeod, he told that. Now, Dr. McLeod come near freezing to death. He went out to deliver a baby, and his Model T car got stuck in the snow. And when he'd come to see Dad, they used to play baseball together. And his fingers was froze so bad that they was just stiff. His wife drove him. And he said he wandered into a farmhouse and fell into the door. And he said, that's about all that saved me. Well, but he said my boy really went to town.
Well, isn't that wonderful? That's a success story.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. All right, now then, let's get back to May. This first store. Now, how did it progress? Tell me, who was the next one in town of May?
Now, that was a fact of the matter. That store done good business. Mm-hmm. My goodness. There wasn't no money, but they was charging, all them cowmen, them old settlers would come in and they charged up. But my mother said very little money that Mr. Russell ever lost. He said those people paid. Their word was good.
Mm-hmm.
But it went along then, and Sam Morey, you heard of him.
Yes.
He bought, he gave $3,800 from a Bank of Woodward at that time and borrowed it to buy a strip of land on east of there, which runs pretty near to Beaver River, and it's just so wide.
Mm-hmm.
Then they call that the Morey's Addition.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where the town of May got started. They had 4 elevators in the town of May.
How did May get its name?
That's what nobody ever knows. We've never been able to find out. No, we don't. Nobody's ever been able to come up with May's name.
Hmm.
There was a woman named Mary Dolby. She helped start the Methodist Church. And nobody knows anything about Mary Dolby because I have got the deed and the abstract to the Methodist Church in May, and I'll prove it to anybody. They can come and read it. And I asked Dad about Mary Dolby, and he was in the church for years. He said nobody knows about Mary Dolby.
Well, okay, then how many stores were there finally in May?
All right. The first store, after they built a new bank, that was the first store. And a man named Meeker Vern Brown built the bank. Then on the west, he built a big store building. Mm-hmm. And a man named Meeker was the first man that ever put a store in that new one. Mm-hmm. And this Meeker married an O'Hare woman from out by Slapout, one of the O'Hares.
You don't know which
She
one?
was an aunt to Pat O'Hare. She was Pat O'Hare's aunt, and her name was Meeker. But Vern Brown, he had the east side of the bank, and he had the vault still. They've tore part of it down. The vault's still there. Mm-hmm. And the first 2 people that ever worked in the Bank of May was Raymond Lawson and Nell Costell and Vern Brown. Of course, Vern owned the bank. Mm-hmm. But this Meeker, I'll never forget, he had an old Model T Buick, a model car, and the handbrake was on the outside of the fender. And you've seen them.
Yeah.
But Vern Brown was a wonderful man. My father thought he was a wonderful man. And he was. He couldn't say no to nobody. But the bank went broke in 1920-something. I can't remember just when. But Vern served a year in the penitentiary for the Bank of May going broke. It wasn't long after, but just maybe before that, the Bank of Spearmore went broke. And Bob Newberry was in that bank, and it went broke. And the Bank of Supply, it went broke shortly about the same time. And Percy Zerby run the bank. I knew all them fellas.
Was that in 29?
About in the 20s. It was back in the 20s.
Mm-hmm. Well, in 29, a lot of banks went.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Newberry, folks filed just north of my folks a mile. And he had a brother named Ray filed on the east side of the road, and Bertha B. filed over on a mile further on over on the other side.
What was the name of the bank in May?
May State Bank. May State Bank was what it went by.
Was that the only bank in May?
That was the only one until now. After it went broke a few years later, Al Chase came from Capron, Oklahoma down, and he reopened the bank, and I think the bank went by the name of the Bank of May. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that's Bank of May. But the May State Bank was the first one ever there.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now then, can you tell me how many stores finally? How big did May get?
Oh,
finally?
gee whiz. It had 2 hotels. Old Man Morris had a hotel. Cummins built one called the Keystone Hotel. It had 2 blacksmith shops. It had 2 lumber yards. It had 4 elevators and 2 drugstores, a shoe shop, and a telephone office, 2 wagon yards. Now this sounds like it's a little bit out of the ordinary, but it was there because this kid seen it. I drove it in there, and my goodness.
Was that before the railroad went through?
Just as it was coming through, when they didn't know whether there was a man he was going to build a town south of May. A mile and a half south of May, and Henry McClung told me what the name of that place was. But they come to find out the railroad was coming right square through May, and everybody got on the boom, and they went to building. Dunlap, the little old town of Dunlap, you know where it is today.
Yeah.
It had a store, a wagon yard, several dwelling business, and a hardware store, and a big elevator. That boy, they had the Irish Syndicate Ranch. They would ship in their cake by the trainloads and feed. They had 2,200 head of cows on that river right north of Maine.
And what outfit was that?
Irish Syndicate. Now, Hal Cooper's dad run it, but there was some people in England, some fellows. Now, that's where the syndicate got started. See, they bought it together, and they came out. Fred Long, he lived there. Bill Herndon lived there. Alfred Knox, a bunch of them lived there. And they just come along, offering so much for their money, for the land, they just moved off.
You sold it to this English
syndicate outfit. And it run from between Supply and Woodward, clear over, and on the other side of May, up on North Hill, and it joined Clarence Piles' folks, 1.5 miles on west of May. It was a big outfit.
About approximately how many acres?
Oh, my goodness, Bernice. Thousands of acres, because look, some of them run clear as high as 5 miles north of May, and then would go, I don't know, it run clear down between Supply and Woodward.
And what year was that?
He came out here about 1905 or 6 and started that. And then he hired people. You see, some of these farmers had put in their fences around their section, their land. They just told the boys, hired them, go in there and go to turn them fences out. And you could just ride it. And in the 30s, Jim Hurst is still living. He's in 880 now. And he fed cattle for them people. Cake. And I wished he was here today to tell you he picked up wagon loads and wagon loads and wagon loads of bones that he knew where cattle had died on that ranch, and hauled them to Dunlap. And I never saw such a stack of bones in all the days of my life. That man hauled in it. Those cattle died. But it was nothing out of Cooper's pocket, because the syndicate was paying everything.
Well, do you think that when you're working for someone like the syndicate, do you take the interest in
No.
In the cattle and things?
I lived with hired men all of my life. I've got one working for me. She'll tell you the same. If you're not there to run your business, you better call the deal off, because there's nobody can see what you can see, and nobody can run your business the way you would run it. And as long as the other man's getting his money, he ain't caring, just so I get paid.
Okay. And are there any other ranches around that you could tell me about?
Well,
was there any south of May, or was that country all settled up?
No. Now, Mr. Linneman, he had a
Yes, tell us about him.
Well, now, just before Mr. Linneman got out there, there's a man named Sam Ney. Now, Maud Fanning today, her mother cooked for Sam Ney's outfit, and he was on Otter Creek. Now, Mr. Linneman, this has been told to me by Pete, his own boy, half a dozen times or more. Mr. Linneman, his name was Tabbo.
How do you spell that?
Huh?
How do you spell
T-A-B-B-O.
And that was his real name?
That Tabbo T. Linneman. I don't know how it come out. But he was at Fort Dodge, Kansas now. Back in about he had to be about 1875. He was what they call a wheelwright man. And he could say that man was a blacksmith. He was good. And he was up there at Fort Dodge. And while he was up there, he was telling about the people moving from Missouri coming through, you know. And he'd work on wagons. He said, I didn't get much money, but he said, I made a living. Now, his youngest boy, Otto, Joe Phillips, my father, and Neil Mason, his dad was an early day man. Otto was born at Camp Supply in 1883. Otto, my dad, and Neil Mason were all the same age. So Mr. Linneman moved down about in the 1870, the latter part of 1870, to Camp Supply. It wasn't Fort then, it was Camp Supply.
Yes, it was.
And he was there till the soldiers left. And he moved out and filed on some land on Otter Creek.
Mm-hmm.
Then the old man's pretty shrewd. He got 2 or 3 fellers to come out and he'd file on the land around proving this. And the old man gave him a little money for it. And they'd move on. That's where he got the land. Then he said he fixed up 2 log wagons. And he moved. They called it the Reynolds and Dave Blacksmith Shop. But down, the old building's still right here in Woodward, right down there at this there fort, or this there museum.
Yes.
I've been in it a million times. I used to help them work their cattle.
Well, tell me about that building. It seems to have quite a history.
Yes. Now, I never could figure this out. They said, Pete told me the logs came from north of Supply, up in them red hills. I never thought there's any logs ever got that big up there, but now that's what he said. He said that's where it come from, his own son.
Mm-hmm.
But they fixed that up, and he said, Dad and me and somebody else, we lived in a tent all winter. And he said, Dad put that up. But that old man was a shrewd duck, that old man Linneman. He was shrewd. He was smart. And it was what they call a picket building. You stood up. If it was laying down, it would have been logs. It was a picket standing up. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'm telling you, it was something to lift them logs. But he said, Dad wouldn't put one down unless it was absolutely right. I'd be on the money. And I was in the house when I was a little kid, and you could open the living room door back on the north side, and you could walk right back through the living room, and there was a door just like this door here. You could just turn the knob and walk right back into the barn. Mm-hmm. And the old man had a lot of horses, and he had quite a few cattle. But I never will forget Pete said one time, Sam Nay, this cowman, old man planted a lot of maize down the bottom. And another thing, he did this, which was against the law. It couldn't happen today. He went away up the creek, and he got my granddad and Granddad Wilson and 2 or 3 guys, and they brought horse slips, 2 horse slips. And they built a channel down, and he went up, and Dad said the creek then wasn't as deep in the canyon it is now. And he had a fix, he just shoved down a block, and that water would raise and run down this, and he just irrigate all of his land, and she'd run out over and back into the creek, run on down the creek. And my dad said, I never saw such alfalfa. My dad used to help him. He said, you never saw such, he said it would get up waist high. You never saw nothing like it. And he said, maize. He said that old man maize down there one year, and he said you couldn't even see the ground for the heads. But Pete was telling me, he said, this here Sam Nay's cattle, some steers come up here and got in his maize. And old man Lindeman, I had to call his dog shipped instead of on them, and run steered off. But Nay was coming up the river and seen him run them. So he rode up to the house. He said, well, Lindeman, he said, I'm going to shoot that dog. He's running my cattle. And Mr. Linneman says, if he hadn't have run your cattle like I set him onto him, he said, I would have shot him. Well, he said, I don't care. He said, I'm going to kill your dog. But so Pete said, I just stepped to the door with my 30-30. And he said, Sam, it's going to be whichever pulled the trigger quick. And said Sam just stuck the gun back in the scabbard and turned around and rode off. Them fellows didn't take any, and Pete filed on 160 acres just south of his. Now, Bob Underwood works for Sheen's Hardware. And the biggest spring you ever saw, I would like to take you there and let you see. It just gushes out of the ground. And that's head of Otter Creek. And that was the Cheyenne Arapaho Territory Indians. Ray Underwood moved down there after Pete lost the place. He lost the mortgage. Mm-hmm. And he moved there. And he'd heard that the Indians buried out on a point. So he goes up on, I'd like to take you, Bernice. I would love to take you there and show you where it was. And he went up there and he didn't dig down over this far on a point, and he found a dead Indian. And they buried the man, and they just brought his hands up like this, brought his legs all up together. and he was buried there. And I went up and looked at him, and his teeth was all wore off. But in the field on south, another fellow listed up 2 Indian bodies, and this fellow just put them in a sack and reburied them.
Mm-hmm.
But the Stillwater College came and got this Indian that was buried at Ray Underwood dug up. Now you can ask Bob Underwood, he works down there, he was there, and he'll tell you about it.
Mm-hmm.
But that was and my wife and me and this girl, we went up and down, we've got more artifacts than anybody. You could just pick up arrowheads with a handful.
Well.
And those Indians, see, they would come there in that shade and
Mm-hmm.
get, all that water was cool. My is a wonderful spring.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm telling them old timers had a hard, and P.T. Lindeman got the first, well, they call it the Bertzel Huller, but alfalfa thresher was what it was, and it was mounted on a wagon frame. You pulled it with horses. And Woodward, that old Tabot, came and bought it from a man named Maddox. He was the first man that had our water store here. And he bought an old 13-horse motor international engine. And you had to line it up with horses and stake it down. And for they don't no magnet on it, but for their spark, they call it make and break spark. And they had to have 12 dry cell batteries like they use in telephones. And now that was their spark. Now I helped load the old Bertzel Huller, and it went down here, and down here by the, I can't think of the name. It's down here now, but it had a brake on it just like a wagon would have. You could just pull your wagon, the brake up and stop it. And the girls sold it to this museum, and they claim if you go see it, it looks just like, it had 2 cylinders in it, no blower on it. When you threshed alfalfa, you had to stand back there with 2 men with a pitchfork. And for putting it, there wasn't no wagons. You caught it in sacks, and you'd turn the thing here, and it'd fill this sack, and then you'd turn this over here and hook another sack on it. And that old engine, it was an International, and it had no radiator on it. It was, I guess, hold about 15-gallon water set up above this piston, and it was what they call a 4-cycle motor. She'd go pow, and then chook, 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 and hit again. You've heard of them. And man, they would just thrash. They thrashed for howled. A lot of people out on way out there out on Kiowa, they thrashed all over the country with it.
What year was that?
Oh, Walter.
Approximately.
You remember Walter Berkey?
Yes, yes.
They went by his place. Walter said, I can remember when they used to come by with that old thrashing outfit, and they'd pull it with mules.
Before Walter.
Oh, he was just a small kid.
Oh, well, that would be back in about what?
Oh, way back then.
1912, 13.
And I'll tell you how good a blacksmith this old man Lindeman was. His boy Pete bought a case steam engine and a case separator, 28-incher. But the old separator, I don't know what became of the steam engine, but the old separator, finally people just picked pieces off of it. And the wheels set up, I don't know, they hauled them away. But there's a band cutter now. You know what I'm talking about, the old band cutter. And one day they were thrashing, and Lloyd Ishmael was with them. So the band cutter shaft broke. And Pete went down to his dad. He says, Dad, we're broke down. I don't know how long will it if I ever get started again. Well, he said, what's the matter? Well, he said, the shaft on that band cutter's broke. And your knives was fastened on with wooden blocks. You see, she'd come over. They said, the old man Lindeman went out and looked at her. Well, he says, Pete, he said, I can weld this. You'll be ready to go in the morning. Pete, he'd throw the fit. He said, well, you can't start to weld it. So he asked Lloyd Ishmael. Now, Golden's dad, Lloyd's dead now. Mm-hmm. Lloyd told me this. He said, the old man went up and we fixed a jig, and he said we had to heat it. And he said the old man used flux. And he said he put that thing back together. And his boy come and looked at it. And he said, as far as I know, when they sold it, the old band was still, baby was still running with the same shaft. The old man put her back. And he made a corn planter, and somebody stole it. And he had wheels on it made out of wood with a iron rim around it. You could put out 2 rows at a time. I wish you could have seen it. He made his own boxes to put the corn in. And every time it run by chain. Every time the wheel went out, he put a cog wheel on back this wheel. Every time she go over, she'll watch corn fall out. See, he just kept it off. He was one of the smartest blacksmiths I ever seen in my life.
Now then, when did they move this?
They just
Picket
moved this
house.
about 2 years ago out there.
When did they move it down to the?
Oh, 1895.
They moved that down?
Yes,
there?
sir. They moved it out of Fort
How
Supply
did they move it?
with 2 sets of wagons. They had 4 head of horses, and the old man fixed him up what they call a log wagon with high steel on the side pipe. And they put on so many logs, see. And Pete said there's so many low places we had to cross. He said we was afraid to get hanging them up. But he said we just put on so many logs and bring them out. And they were already cut, see.
And they took the house down?
Yes, they took
log
it
by
down at
log?
Fort Supply and brought it out there.
Uh-huh. How many miles would that
Oh my goodness, they had to move it at least about 16 or 17 miles.
That far?
Yeah, they just come across the country with it because there wasn't no fences.
No. Well, and what did they use that house for then on the farm?
How?
What did they use the house for on the farm?
Well, they lived in it and
Oh,
used
they
it for a
did?
barn. Yes.
Okay.
And the closest place you could go to buy any groceries was Gage. And we lived 17 miles from Gage. And the mailman, he came by with a little old hack carrying the mail with a little team of mules. His name was John Woodfin. And several times I've seen him come to the door and say, "Maud, have you got any hot coffee?
Oh.
Come on in." She said, "We'll soon have something." They'd put the coffee pot on. He'd have a shot of coffee and crawl on that old mail hack. And I wouldn't have drove the thing. I wouldn't have drove 10 miles for the President of the United States.
And how old were you at that time?
I was about 5 years old.
Uh-huh.
Oh, Lord.
What do you remember your folks telling you, or maybe you've heard others talk, about Camp Supply?
Well, I got more from Pete Lenneman than anybody.
Okay.
This fellow was named Roselle. Pete said I was just a kid. And he said he came to me, and the soldiers were still at Fort Supply. He was just a kid yet. And north where Hal Cooper's ranch is now, Pete said I never saw such a hay meadow. This Roselle took a contract from the government to put up so much hay and bring it to the Camp Supply for the cavalry horses. And he said the only way we had to haul it was with oxens. So he said Roselle had 2 big hay wagons made, and he said he just made them out of, he said they had a wagon frame, but he said he just made them out of some limbs and things. Said they loaded me up one day, and I got in the creek and couldn't get the cows out. It was so hot. He said the steers, they just stayed in the creek. He said I couldn't get them out, no way. He said I just rode up and told Roselle to go get your hay. It's down there in the creek. He said I got fired. He said it's just tickled me to death.
Now that would be the Beaver.
Yeah, across
Beaver
Beaver River. It's right north of the hospital. But I used to get, and Otto, I used to get more kicked. Now, he never was married. Pete had 2 daughters. He married his wife, and she died. And old grandmother Lenneman, she died in 1905. But what I liked about Otto better than anything, you see, when they lived on the creek, there's a lot of wild grapes, a lot of them. And he had 2 10-gallon crock jars. And he'd go up and down that creek picking them wild grapes. And he'd get a lot of them. And I watched him a few times. And he'd come back and he'd get him a 2 before, he'd make grape wine. You ought to take a little nip of it, boy. It's pretty good stuff.
It was.
And he would nip, and he'd look into it, churn him a little more. He'd put his sugar in and everything. He'd say that old Dutchman could make her, brother. And I'll bet you he had 25, 30 jugs in a little room out of that house. This wine is 2 years old. This wine is just a year old. I just made this wine. But you can't drink this wine. You got to drink this 2-year-old one. They called me down there one time, and we castrated a terrible bunch of steers. And I castrated every one of them standing up. But they had a lot of fellows there helping us. But we sitting by the fire, and it's pretty cold. I'll never will forget it. I don't believe in getting drunk, or I didn't believe it, any part of it. But we started out the door, and I was next to the last, and Otto, he reached up and grabbed me by the back of the shirt. Come back in here. I said, what? Well, you can't work unless you get something out there to kind of buck that weather with. He poured a glass of wine. Pretty darn good stuff, Bernice, awful good stuff. I drank that one, he gave me another one. I'm going to tell you something, brother, it wasn't nothing bothered me. I cut half a fingerprint off, castrating steroid. I said, I just stuck her back in the dip, and I said, just keep on bringing them, boys, didn't bother me any. Listen, you drink a few jars of that stuff, and I'm telling you, you'd slap your grandma over. Man, he could make it.
Oh, dear.
Oh, Lord.
Okay, what else can you tell me about the early days back in that time? What about the bank robberies there?
Oh, that was the best. They didn't get very far with it. But this St. Clair, when they caught up with this, I'll tell you how well they had it planned. They had it planned, they'd already went down and cut the brush and they had brush and weeds and everything else, and this kid was going to hide his car, and they already had it covered up. But one of the fellows happened to glance down and see it, and they says, where'd Mathis go? There's his car down there. He didn't know anything about it. But St. Clair didn't know, because when they dug the money out of his granary, he didn't have much to say. But they just dropped it, and they all left.
Mm-hmm.
But
they recovered the money then.
They was already had it all planned. But they told me, which I think was a false statement, they said they had planned to rob the May Bank and the Laverne Bank the same day. And my grandfather just laughed. He said, you know, Lee Mathis, Tom Sumter was Lee Mathis' uncle. And he was in the bank working up there that day. Tom didn't own nothing, but he was working for the Stewart. Granddad said, you know, that would have been a thrill to see old Tom get to see his nephew stick the gun in his face. But they never did get to rob the Bank of Laverne.
No. Okay. Then the next thing, you had to go to the Army, did you?
I sure did.
World War II.
Now,
do you remember anybody talking about World War I?
Sure.
Tell me about it. Let's talk about that first.
I'm pretty sure you remembered 2 or 3 of the boys. Jim Crooks had 3 boys and went to the Army. Cecil, Pearl, and Harry. All 3. Now, they were the older.
One?
They went to World War I.
Oh, they did.
Now, we buried Cecil the other day at May. And he was the last man in our whole country around here that ever wore a World War I uniform. And he had a military ceremony out at the cemetery. But them Crooks boys were good people. And that Jim, their dad, I'm telling you, I shouldn't say this, but he was just rough as hell. Brother, you had to work just like you down in Phillips's. You had to work on a dead run or you wasn't getting any place. And them boys went on a dead run. But it's telling me about them boys being in them trenches. They fought more in trenches in them days than any place. They said it was pretty slow fighting. And Pearl Crooks sent Dad a picture of him. Harry Crooks sent Dad a picture of him in his uniform, and so did Cecil. When my daddy died, I took all those pictures and gave them to Mrs. Cecil Crooks. Now, I says, you just give these to the Crooks people that we should have them. And she gave and Harry. And then we had 2 or 3 other fellows in the Army, but Marshall Harrison, he served in the Army. He was gassed in the Army. Brownie Tiffins at Gage, he was gassed. Brownie died over it. No, he just choked out, and he finally died. But that was the worst weapon at them times that Kaiser Bill ever had. Now, his name was Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm. But that was his main goal, was poison gas. And when I was in World War II, we all carried a gas mask. But old Hitler never had no gas. But all they ever had, they called them old long barrel BB guns. They didn't have no up-to-date, and old horse cannons, they've drawn. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was where, that was their main headquarters for Oklahoma, and they'd buy Army horses and send them overseas. And old Doc Rankin, a bunch of them fellows, they was in the Army, they drove them horses. And after the war, World War I was over, here they come back with all this harness, and they would sell, trucks would come through May and stop. My folks bought 3 sets of brand new harness. It said U.S. on the bridle, up on the blinders, and on the back band. They bought 3 sets of them. And these long lash whips, my granddad bought several of them. And raincoats, they'd give them to you if you take them, old slickers. And any way to get rid of them. And I'm telling you what, the way that boys talked to me, that was, and I'll say this, up to date, you could have took George Machine Guns Kelly and George Pretty Boy Floyd and went over there and whipped a whole bunch of them, as slow as they was going.
Well.
But they was talking about, now look, Bernice, if you just take out to run out here and run a cannon, and you have to shoot over so far, and you'd have to go move that cannon with horses, you'd never get no place. Never. Not like, I was in a war where we went fast. Brother, we went in a hurry.
Talking about World War I, do you remember the flu epidemic?
I sure do.
Time?
I sure do, and say it was terrible.
Did you folks have it?
No.
You didn't have the flu?
I never had flu in my life.
Well, you're lucky.
And several died. Do you remember people died? A lot of them died then. But during World War I, my dad was, I don't know about my dad. He was always pushing for everything. Pushing for an elevator, pushing for better schools, hated to lose the railroad, wanted to see a better community. And he was in there getting money, organizing, giving to the government, get the government some money to have World War I, get it to going. He put out quite a lot money he could. Everybody bought bonds. You could buy bonds for the help the war out. Fact of the matter, I think that's really what hurt the Bank of May a little bit, was that. But I remember one boy that went to the Army, and his name was Floyd Strait. Max Horner went. There was 3 or 4, and they came back. But Floyd Strait was built like a wrestler. Man, he was a horse. He was home about a year, and this man named Charlie Davis lived north of May, and all he ever done was bootleg, run race horses, and gamble. Now, Jenks Siggers at Laverne, you remember him? He married Charlie Davis's older daughter, Bernice. But he bet Floyd Strait that he couldn't carry 175 pounds of sand a mile, which was a terrible load. I was there and seen it. He put up $2,000 that he could do it. And he started a mile south of May and put it up over his back and carried it down to where Haskell Crooks lives today. And the law was, if you stumble and fall, Charlie gets the money. You can't stop and rest. You can't shift the load to another side. You've got to keep it going. And old Strait just kept right on and paddling. I don't see how the man ever carried it. You don't know how much of a load that is. I couldn't even pick it off the ground.
175 pounds.
Huh?
175
That's he
pounds?
carried it, and I've got the proof, every bit of it.
Well, how did when the banks went broke in 1929, how did that affect you and your folks?
Well, I'm going to tell you this. I hate to put this on, but I'm going to put it on. Bill Phillips, my grandfather, he couldn't read and write his own name, but I'm going to tell you, don't try to beat the old man in the trade, or no, don't never try to beat him if you can't do it. But that old man had a little money. He figured something might happen, so he had a little money in another bank. But they come with this old story. The Phillipses took their money out of the Bank of May, and that's what broke it. That was the biggest lie anybody ever made. And my granddad got peeved one time. He bought 20 sacks of flour at the May elevator, where the new elevator stand now. In them days, we had to use your own flour, bake your bread. Well, here the government comes and says, you can't have that flour. You can have 1 sack. That's all you get. You got to give that other back to government.
Yes. remember that.
And I wouldn't tell what Granddad said because it wouldn't do to put it in tape.
But he gave the flour back.
He never did get the flour. He had to go back and go to buying his flour. They took it away from him.
Well.
And he got through, but my granddad was a very high-tempered man. He was a very high-tempered man. Did you ever hear of a man named, in Kansas City, he used to run Kansas City, Tom Pendergrass?
I've heard of him.
Him and my granddad. See, Granddad lived in Kansas City. I don't want to ever tell what Granddad was all done in Kansas. One thing, he used to run racehorses. He said politics is the only thing to be in. That's where the old man made his money. Tom Pendergrass and Granddad was pretty good friends, awful good friends. And my father was a Christian man. He said, son, there's nothing on earth stinks any worse than politics. And I'm going to tell you today, Bernice, all you've got to do is step out and you can smell Washington, D.C. coming across here. It stinks that bad. Now, I don't care whether people like it or not. I'm telling you the truth. Ain't I right? You've got some of the lowest people on earth right in Washington, D.C. And you can put that on tape if you want to. If they want to throw me in jail, it suits me.
It's on tape.
It suits me fine. But Granddad used to laugh, and he said old Tom had a nephew. And he said, Bill, I'm going to make that boy there the boss of Kansas City someday. That was young Tom. That was Harry Truman's boss. He was the guy that bossed Harry Truman.
Mm-hmm.
So, by golly, Granddad, he says, I think old Tom done a wonderful job on that kid. He said he's running Kansas City. And my father says, I wouldn't take Kansas City if you would give it to me. He said, I don't want any part of it. My grandfather used to run gambling halls and everything else. And I will tell you what my father said. He ran several saloons. He owned them. Mm-hmm. He said, I've seen women come to my father's saloon and stand at the door and wait for their husbands to come in from work. Instead of coming home, they would go to the saloon, and a woman wasn't allowed inside. And he said, I've seen women stand there and wait for the husband. Now, come on, let's get away. Don't you go in there. The children don't have anything to eat. We need some clothes at home. We need this. Y'all get out. Get out. And they'd go on in, set up the drinks, and everybody would drink, and the kids at home would do them without. Mm-hmm. That turned my father against whiskey quicker than anything in the whole world. Mm-hmm. But Granddad says, look after yourself first, and anything left you might help the neighbors out.
That was his way of looking at it.
But he said, I don't see how my mother ever raised us kids. He said, Dad got shot. And he said, we was poorer than Job's turkey. God, he said, I don't see how.
Granddad.
Granddad Phillips. He said, I don't see how we ever raised
Bill
him.
Phillips.
Mm-hmm.
And he said after Dad got shot, he said it was pretty bad. He said it was awful. But I will say one thing. Abraham Lincoln was the greatest president the United States ever had. Because he said, if slavery is right, then there's nothing on earth right. And he was right, just as right as he could be. Mm-hmm. I wish they'd never brought the colored man over to this country. But they're starving to death in Africa today. You can see it day after day, and I don't know how they're going to, there's no way stopping it. You can't stop it. No way.
Now, let's get back to the dirt storm days.
Oh, boy, that was real.
Tell me about those.
Can I give you a little, you know, I like to make up poems, and I was an auctioneer back, I'd auctioneer and sales back that day. You remember, Bryce? I used to, Bryce.
Heard you.
I made up a little old saying. I want you to put it on this record.
Okay.
It was back in the 30s when the dirt started to blow, and a lot of the people said, we've just got to go. So they packed up their belongings and what they had left, and the biggest majority of them, they went on west. But as they was leaving, this song they would sing. It's hurrah for Oklahoma, it's the land of the free. the home of the grasshoppers, the bedbugs, and fleas. We'll sing of its praises, and we'll shout of its fame, while we were starving to death, just awaiting for rain.
That's good. Okay. Now then, how did your mother, you weren't married during the dirt storm days. How did your mother keep the dirt out of her house?
Oh my God, don't mention that. You didn't keep it up. You could go around my dad's house was a good house, and you could go around, take rags and stick them in the windows. And that dirt was just as fine as flour. It would come in. Mm-hmm. I don't care what kind of a house it would come in. Mm-hmm. And you remember this, and Bryce remembers. One day, it was on May or April, when that terrible storm come from the north.
Mm-hmm. That Black Sunday.
Oh my goodness, I'll never forget that as long as I live. Ray Underwood come in, Ed Wellman, and here they come driving in at Dad's. And you could see the birds are coming and all that flock. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, that's one time this old boy, I started talking to the master upstairs. I said, this must be it. And it got just as black as night for about 3 hours. Or you couldn't see, Bryce, you couldn't see nothing. And we just sat in there, and that dirt would sickle through there in that house, and you could feel it coming in your nose. And we had a neighbor boy, his name is Roy Jordan. He lives at Leafers, Texas today, and he's working for Bill Sells. Miss Sells seen this coming. They just come in from a meeting at the Holiness Church. She started praying and hollering for God to help him. The old man said he's putting his shoes on, so he said, I'll tell you what you'd better do, Mom. You better call on somebody a little closer right now. And Roy said, I got more kick out of that than anything in the world. Everybody was scared of that storm. You have to be if you're in your right mind. Mm-hmm. But my mother, we raised garden, my star. She would have beef, tomatoes, you just name it. That cellar was crammed all the time. But I've seen the highs we'd be feeding 11 and 12 or 13 men, the thrashing time. And we always had a couple of hired hands going all the time. Mm-hmm. Oh, we had quite a time, but World War II was one.
Okay, what year did you volunteer?
No, I didn't.
They drafted you, or you were in the draft?
I was in the draft.
Okay.
I married, did you ever remember Cleo Harvey? Cleo Berkey?
Yes.
I married her sister, Fern.
I know.
I married her one day and told her goodbye the next. I went to the Army. But we went down and took her exam. I got more kick out of this than anything. We went down, it was in February, to take our physical exam. The old doctor called me off the side, and we took her clothes off. They checked me every way in the world. And he said, young man, he says, I've checked you over, and I can't find anything wrong with you. The injuries? And I says, no, sir, doctor. As far as I know, I said, I've just got one thing wrong with me. Well, he looked at me, and he said, well, tell me what it is. Well, I'll tell you, doctor, what it is. It's my mind. I said, my mind ain't right. He looked at me and just kind of grinned, and he said, young man, he said, that just puts you up in 1A. Yeah, it put me up in 1A. So I was headed for the Army.
Okay, where were you inducted at then?
I went to Fort Sill, and they shipped me out there to Camp Bowie, Texas.
And what division were you in?
I was in the first, at that time called 50 Signal Battalion. And then we got in, when we went, we loaded out up at New Jersey. And when we got overseas, we got Eisenhower's Army, and it was 50 Signal Battalion over there. And we was just one single company, but they put us in with another company, and it was A, B, and C company, but we was in C company. But I'm telling you, it got a little exciting when we made Normandy. It was awful. Mm-hmm. But we loaded out at Bristol, England that night. We'd all on the boats ready to go. Mm-hmm. And about dark, we started to cross that channel, English Channel. And
Do you know how many boats there were?
oh my goodness, Bernice, I couldn't. Yeah, they was loaded up. They had ammunition on. There's big, just big floats that's bringing over ammunition.
Mm-hmm.
The battleship Missouri was ahead of us, sitting out there,
Mm-hmm.
and the Germans knew we was coming. They knew it. But the best part of it, old Hitler had his guns set in cement at Cherbourg Peninsula up out there on the end. He couldn't turn them. We went around behind him.
Oh.
And you could get up on St. Mary Glees on the hill and look way back there, and you could see the White Cliffs of Dover in England, way across 22 miles across there.
Mm-hmm.
But, boy, I'm telling you,
Did you have any problems crossing?
no, we hit a buoy that night, and everybody was playing poker in the cellar. I thought somebody had bombed the ship. But see, that buoy was out in the ocean, see, it just is a guiding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just nothing but a big heavy, it could be heavy cement or something. But she hit the side of that ship, and I was laying down on a bunk.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I jumped out. I said, well, I guess, boys, we've had it. And there's a bunch of playing poker on the floor. They wasn't the one picked up a dime. They all got ready to leave. They left the money. The money wasn't exciting then.
Yes.
And to come to find out, we run into that buoy. But by daylight, man, business picked up.
Okay, tell me
We
about it.
flew. The English had these here. These here big planes. You know, they would just float in. They had no motors on them. They was just
Gliders?
fly gliders.
Gliders.
They glided in 17 miles. They knew where they were going to light at. They glided in 17 miles that night over the channel and landed, and some of them landed in the water. But every one of them had machine guns and everything else, and they said, you just keep coming back, come right on back, and bring the Germans with you. And the Germans knew they couldn't handle us. So,
You mean the gliders got behind the Germans?
yeah, you see, them Germans, they would all settle right on that, they would settle right down on the peninsula. They knew they was going to stop us.
Mm-hmm.
But here our boys come in behind them, and they landed in parachutes and things.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I'm telling you, they just drove them Germans right up. They drove them right up to the channel,
Mm-hmm.
and
And there you boys set out.
and
here.
we was in the we was out in the water yet,
Mm-hmm.
and them Germans was way back there 20 miles throwing them old 88s in, and when they hit that water, man, I'm telling you, the water would fly.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of got a kick out of it, but I was still praying. I was talking to that man upstairs mostly.
Mm-hmm.
I had one boy named Lloyd Turner and couldn't make him keep his helmet on. He said, told the lieutenant, he said, I can't stand this. He said, I can't stand it. I said, hey, Turner, you better get down and do a little praying, because I said, this next one comes in, might get in your pocket. And I just tormenting the poor devil.
Mm-hmm.
But that old battleship Missouri, we called it Harry Truman. Man, it did bang them. But they had those great big pillboxes built. Germany, right up on the edge of it. The walls was that thick.
Mm-hmm.
And they was looking right down our throats. They was pouring the lead to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we would start in, and maybe the red light would come on us. We'd got on the shore, and the red light come on. We'd turn around and come back. We made 2 attempts, but we made the third one before we could get on the land. And them old jeeps that hit that water off them there landing barges, and I've seen many of barracks bag just go floating off down, and they just lost their clothes, but they just kept on and going. And we had several boys laying right out there on the sand. You could see that. But what tickled me, the infantry got in there, and they'd slip around up with them there big old pillboxes, you know, and they'd pull out a hand grenade. Ploo! Ploo! All you had to do was go up and look in then, and it was all over.
Mm-hmm.
At Nordhausen, Germany, she can tell you about, I'd like to show you the picture. 2,000 dead people.
Oh my.
I would love for you to see it. That was one of his prison camps. It was just as bad as Dachau or any of them other places.
Mm-hmm.
But he had his underground, that's where he made it ME-109, as Hitler did, and it was underground. And he had those slaves under there working, and they never seen daylight until they died, and he just take and throw them out like you would a dead cat. But
Well, which one of the phases were you in?
I was in the Signal Corps and trying to keep up with the infantry. And what tickled me, they called my truck driver, his name was Gerald Orr, and the last I've heard of Gerald, he was in Wichita, Kansas, but he was my truck driver. And we went over the side. I went down on a ladder, and I said, get in that truck, stay with it, kid. I'll be down there with you. And I went over the side on a ladder, rope ladder, and got in there. We got out and was going up we was going up towards St. Mary Galice, which was about 2 miles in town. And old Orr says, you know, I would just love to see a German. I said, you would. We didn't go 100 yards. I looked down there, and they had 1,700 German prisoners rounded up down there. I says, or just give me the wheel, and you go down and join your buddies. I said, there's plenty of Germans. My God, he said, let's get out of here. And we just kept it going. We got in that night, and we got located just outside of St. Mary Galice. The captain came to me and he says, Phillips, round up about 4 or 5 boys and take right down that road. And headquarters is right here. And our telephone, Bernice, was just a little leather bag run by 2 telephone batteries. And he said, you go to that hospital down there and put in 2 phones. I said, I'll sure do my best, Captain. I found it. My God, oh, what a sight. My God. I put one in. I put up the phone. I looked down there, laid a boy with his nose shot off his face. Here laid another boy over here with his arm practically shot off, and a nurse was sitting there using a tourniquet on it, keep him bleeding to death. Here laid another boy down there that looked like his foot was shot off. I had about all that I could stand. But I put in two telephones, and I called back to headquarters. I said, you got good reception, boy. You done good. So I went on back to company, and the next morning we started out. Oh, it was, the old saying is, we give them all the hell we could give them. I didn't believe in it. Now, I've got a picture of this. Hitler had what he called his baby manufacturing place. I'll let you read the book. If you want to read it, I'll bring it to you. You can have it. I'll give it to you. I went right down along this big building, but I didn't know at that time what was in there. He had girls, women, but pretty well educated, and he would send German officers in there to get these women pregnant, and he would give them so much money and a medal or something. But I didn't know that until I'd got on by it and was in the truck, and one old boy said, we ordered one in Hitler's baby factory back there and took a look at the gals, see how good they looked. And I didn't know what was going on at that time, but I'll let you read it. I'll show you the picture of it. And they called us one time when they had the breakthrough. Brother, that was...
Can you tell me about it?
First, before we got to it, I can't think of the name of this place right now. Battle of St. Lowell. St. Lowell was up on the hill, and we was down in the valley. We tried twice to get up there. Them Germans would shove us back. One morning, the captain gave orders, said, everybody load up, we're going. We all said, some more BS are coming. We ain't going up there. Them Germans is up there. Said they'll shove us back. And they was dug in the banks. They was in brush and everything else. We sat there, and pretty soon the earth started shaking. And I looked up. There was 100 bomber planes come over, bombers. We was back about 5 or 6 miles. And I'm telling you, Bernice Jackson, that earth trembled, and it trembled, and she trembled, and they just kept dropping them and dropping them. When we went, we had to go around the ditches and plow our way up through there. But it wasn't anything to see part of an old German laying out here, arm blowed off, and could walk. He didn't know nothing. He was shell-shocked. And the trees was that big around, there wasn't no trees left. It was all gone. Everything was burnt up.
Trees was about
it was all
3
gone.
feet through?
Huh?
The trees were about
Lord,
3 feet?
They could be 40, 50 feet high. There wasn't no trees left. They blowed them all to pieces. And when we got to Aachen, the Germans said there'll be no American soldier ever set his foot on German soil. we blowed we just blowed the hell out of Aachen. Man, oh
You
man.
mean with the bombers?
Oh, we blowed it with bombers.
Mm-hmm.
They stood off those, we called them the Sherman tanks. You ought to see them. It took a big cat tractor to pull them. They would stand off 25 miles from Aachen. And I've stood and watched them. They'd load them old big guns up and she'd go off and that old big gun would go boom and that old baby would recoil and we'd hit Aachen. And we were just blowing them Germans completely off the map. They had to give it up.
You know, the pitiful part of that was that there were innocent women and children killed.
But, now hold it. Some of those thought Hitler was the greatest thing that they ever had. And I said, I couldn't speak German, but they could speak a little American, some of them. Mm-hmm. I said, you people thought Hitler was such a wonderful man. I said, he never was born and raised in Germany. He's an Austrian born. I said, he come into your country. I said, he took over, and you thought he was good. Now, I said, you say he's kaput. I said, you can't take your own medicine. I said, look what you done to France. Look what you done to other. And I said, look at Italy, what they've done to Italy. I said, they turned his boss up and hung him by his heels and let him die that way. And Golden Ishmael come through Italy and burning cells. And he said, Angie, old brother, they blowed us back and they kept blowing us, but we finally got on shore. Old Mussolini thought Hitler was something, didn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they all went down the same drain. Mm-hmm. And when war was over, we was cleaning up our part of Germany, and they sent me and a bunch of boys down to a place called Karlsruhe. And there's a big hospital there. And I never seen so many German boys with their legs blowed off, arms blowed off, part of their heads blowed up. Mm. You never saw so many of them. And there's a big swimming place down there, so I took Saturday afternoon off us boys. And I went up and sat down and watched them. And here come some of them German boys could speak English. Mm. And they come up and sit down by me, and I enjoyed talking to them. Mm-hmm. And they says, we want to tell you something. We had what they call a 50 caliber machine gun on all of our trucks, you know, them old big boys. You could just lean back, you know, and mm-hmm. you could pick an airplane out of the sky way up there. Them German boys says, whatever you fellas do, keep that 50 caliber machine gun. He said, we've learned to respect that gun. He said, someday you're going to fight Russia. I said, boys, I really think you're wrong. No, he says, it's coming, fella. You can't see it, but we can. Where we made our mistake, Roosevelt made us sit back and wait till Stalin. We was set there for so long. Roosevelt sold us down the river. We could have went on and took Berlin and stopped that East and West Berlin. We'd have said, no, Joe, whenever we meet you, that's what we'll take. And from there on, we'll run the show. But Roosevelt's, no. And that, you know, I got so tired of that there Churchill. That guy was nothing. He was just a stooge. He'd run around with that big cigar in his hand, you know, and drink his fifth of vodka. And victory, victory, victory. If it hadn't been for the United States, they couldn't have whipped nobody. No, they couldn't have whipped nobody.
If it hadn't been for the United States, when Germany whipped England?
Bernice, they could send over there one regiment of men and whipped England. Could have done it easy. And what I never could figure out, why Hitler didn't go take England and the United States would have had no place to land, wouldn't. He could have took Scotland and England. They're 175,000 years behind time, and all they ever done was drink tea up there and eat a little Coke or something like that, and burn a little Coke. And if they've got a farm that's 75 acres in it, it's a terrible big farm. Mm-hmm. And they used to tell me, they'd say, Choppy, what do you think of dear old England? I said, I don't think it amounts to very much. And boy, I'm telling you, they had no use for me. And I said, you know the greatest day we've got in the United States? No, what is it? I said, it's the 4th of July. That's just when we whipped hell out of England. And boy, I'm telling you, they couldn't stand her.
They didn't like you.
No, they don't like the 4th. They won't speak about the 4th of July.
Well, they won't.
And I just wish to God that Harry Truman would have blown Japan off the map. Now, he hit Hiroshima with that bomb, and he killed a lot of them, burned them up. But you can't get those Japs to speak about the Patan Death March where they killed 1,000 of our own boys. That can't be brought up. Now they're coming over here and they're hugging them and kissing them and inviting them in, and they're putting their own people out of labor. They're running their own country. But they're cussing Mexico, and those people are starving to death. But the Japs is coming over here, and they're working free of charge. And I've been telling these guys, I said, see who gets the job. You see who's getting it. The Japs is coming over here getting it. They're getting it. Bernice, if things don't change, time I'm an old man, I'll get my 22 out, and I'll be trying to run them Japs back across the pond. God, I can't.
You weren't shipped across, though, to fight the Japs.
I went over with 7 shipload of men, and we landed at Greenock, Scotland. We had to go way up there. But at night, I'd go out on the deck, see, and each ship had a light, and they'd turn on maybe 2 green lights, it'd flicker. Then maybe pretty soon they'd turn on a red light, it'd flicker. Well, when we was on the water, I think, over a week, and I asked Captain, I said, Captain, what's those lights flickering at night for? He said, Phillips, he said, they're dodging. He said, they're changing course. This and the way this, if there's a submarine under there, he said, we're trying to miss them submarines. And that was why the lights was, see, each boat had a light to go by.
That was their signal.
That was their signals, what they was doing, the way they was taking, they was reading, you see, by compass. But all we knew, we were just riding along with them. Yeah,
was that on your trip going over?
Going over, but when I come back on the Queen Mary, and I'm telling you, I wasn't long getting here.
Oh, the Queen
Man, why I came back in first class.
Well, you never did see a submarine, though.
I never did. No one see any.
And whereabouts did you land on England?
In Greenock, Scotland, and we had a train awaiting for us. And the first time I ever heard a bagpipe play, they had a bunch of fellas out there playing bagpipes, and they called them the ladies from hell, you know, had their skirts on and their things on. And I got on the train, and they was blowing away, and I saw one fellow. I said, I don't think they've ever hit a tune yet. I said, tell the train to wait here. Let's see if they can play Home Sweet Home or something. And them boys got more kick out of that than anything.
And then you went from Scotland and down.
We went into England first. And that's where fact of the matter, that's where we formed our armies to go across the channel. And England was loaded with American soldiers. Crime and you never saw such a mess of them. They had infantry boys, they had heavy tank boys, they had signal boys, they had everything. And I helped run the lights, my signal company run the lights on the Andrews airfield in England. And we was going in over bombing Germany. And while we was working there, here would come 20 planes back from bombing Germany. And if they dropped one red signal, one red light, they'd fly, they'd circle, see, they'd drop one red signal. They had one wounded man on. He had priority. He come down the landing strip first. And your ambulance would meet him and get him right off there and take him to the hospital. If they dropped 3 red signals, they had 3 wounded men. And the boys would drive right under them old big planes, right under the wings of them, and unload them and get them out of there. And I went down one day and I looked at one plane. They took 2 wounded. And they were the hole blowed in that wing that you and I both could crawl through it dead easy. And you see, you had a front gunner, a belly gunner, and a tail gunner. And I wouldn't want to been any one of either one of them gunners. I'm telling you, it was dangerous.
Yes.
We had a fellow named Daling. He's from California, and he was on our he stayed on our 50 caliber on our truck, and he would always petting that old 50 caliber, oiling it, and he even went and they gave him one extra barrel. You fire that just a little bit, and that old barrel gets just as hot as it can be. And if you watch it, it shoots every fifth shell would be red, you see, and you could tell right where he was going by every 5th shell. And if that barrel gets hot, it would look like it's shooting circles. And you had a lever there, you jerk that off, put in a new one. That bird went and stole another one off of somebody. He had three.
Huh?
And I said, Daly, I hope you never get to use it. But I said, that's awful stealing that man's, whoever you got it from. So, one day we was in Germany, and we heard a noise, and there's a plane come out of a cloud, and it was an ME-109. And there was two boys. There was another truck there, and that old alien says, "Watch this one, boys." And you know, he put that right square in that door of that there plane. The plane started up, and Daly said, "I'll give him some more of it." And he turned it on him again, and the old plane come down. And that big motor went in the ground so far that you could walk up and see it. And the man that was piloting, his legs come off up here, and he flew off out the side and was on fire. So I've seen a lot of things over there.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen more than I care about seeing. Because some of them you don't forget things like that. Never will forget it.
And of course you've seen the Americans shot down.
Oh, one evening, just before we went in, we was picking up wire in France. And I could smell something terrible. And I was throwing this here wire off of the, see a lot of hedge fences over, a lot of hedge fences. Mm-hmm. I was throwing it off. Hey, fella, hold it just a minute. I looked over, and there lay the second lieutenant with his arm shot off, a leg boogered up, and I don't know how long he laid there, but the screw worm was coming out of his eyes and his mouth. Now, you can take it for what it's worth, but I'm telling you the God's truth. Oh, no, I wouldn't tell it to you.
Was that American boy?
That's American's lieutenant laying there.
Oh, my. Well, let's get you back to the United States.
I'm glad to be here. It's the best place. You don't know it, buddy. You're living in heaven. And you better thank God he gave us this heaven, too. Ain't that right?
When you came back on the Queen Mary,
Yes.
I suppose you were fed a lot of good food and entertained with music, or you weren't?
We was so daggone excited to get home, we didn't want to eat anything.
What did you think when you saw the Statue of Liberty?
I want to tell you this. We sailed out at night, real at night, so you went out. Mm-hmm. And I looked up the old Statue of Liberty, and I said, "So long, sweetie. I hope I see you." I come back, and 3 years later, and when I went by, I said, "Well, honey, you look just as good as you ever did to me." Oh. And we sailed right back to Hudson River, right back past her again. And she's a beautiful. France gave us that. Did you know it?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And we got it when we got to where you could see land. You never seen so many blankets, old boots, and the boys didn't want to carry them home. They just threw them out in the ocean, went out the portholes.
Well.
Yeah.
They wanted rid of those.
But what tickled me, when we loaded up at Fort Dix, New Jersey, you never saw so many drunks there was in our outfit. Now, I wasn't drunk. And a guy by the name of Bill Nidifer, he was from Texola, Oklahoma, right down on the line. He's big, husky fella. But you better leave him alone because he was rougher than Joe Louis. And they called formation, and there wasn't over half of us come out. Wasn't over half of us. The rest of them was drunk.
Well.
And they had a guy in the outfit, he'd been in the Navy for 4 years, named Parker, and they called him Roughhouse. But Captain Smith, he called us out by twos, and he says, "Phillips, you and Bill Nidifer go together." And he named some more to go together. So we started out. Captain knew where this guy was. He came to me and says, "Phillips, go down there in that boiler room. And old Roughhouse is down there. Crawl back under that big boiler, and you can see his feet are sticking out." Oh, he was tough. He ever hit you, you went down. I'll never forget him. So we went back. Old Bill's, he got one foot and I got the other, and we pulled him out, you know. Oh, he come out. He was mad and fighting, but there's a big iron poker there that stirred this. He was going to hit me. I said, "You hit me, Parker." And I said, "I'll promise you one thing. You will never get out of here alive. They'll come and get you. The ambulance carry you back dead." And he never touched me, but he went to bawling, went to crying. Mm-hmm. He says, they're going to ship us over there. The water on, they're going to kill us. He said, it's going to be awful. I said, what are you bawling about, Parker? I said, you want to live forever? And old Bill Nidifer still laughs about that the last time I see him. He said, you reckon old Parker wants to live forever? We had some pretty rough characters on that outfit. Rough, brother, howdy.
Well, could you hardly blame the boys for getting drunk?
Yes, I didn't get drunk.
No.
And I took 2 barracks bags full of beer and whiskey, put them on a trunk. I says, take them over there and put them on the ship. It belongs to the lieutenants and the captain. But Captain Smith didn't drink. He didn't have. And another one, a little Birchmore, didn't drink. But we had some of the lowest people on there. United States Army carriers, some of them kind of people. Then they carry some good men.
Mm-hmm. When you got back, what did you do?
Oh, my sorry.
And where were you given your discharge?
They discharged me down at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
First thing I done, I run for the telephone. I called my dad, and I couldn't get a hold of my wife. I called my mother, and nobody at home. But my wife, she couldn't. Every day she'd go get a newspaper, and that was a mistake. They'd always tell the name of the boys coming in, see on newspaper. Mm-hmm. She knew I was coming in, but I got a hold of her and Dad. I got home the 1st of October, and I wanted to fix me up a house. Dad said he ain't got no time to fix up a house. So I and my wife had to live with my dad for 6 months. We haven't got any wheat drill. We ain't got any calves taken care of. We ain't got this done. I said, what have you been doing? Oh, I said, we've been plodding along here. So I stayed there, I and my wife. Next spring, we fixed up our home, got things to going. And I've been going ever since. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I'll go much longer. I'm getting too old.
Then where did you move to when you moved from your dad's place?
When I what?
When you moved from out of your dad's home, where did you
I
move?
fixed up a place. I bought this place before I went to the Army.
Oh.
And Dad hired a hand. He was living in it. And he'd moved out when I come. And
Is that where you live now?
Yeah, no, my wife built that new home.
Oh.
So we moved this old house, and she fixed it up nice. We had a nice home. Mm-hmm. But she said, I'd like to have a better home. We finally wrestled around, got enough money together. She built it. We've got a nice home. I wish to God she was living to live in it.
Sure.
But she isn't here, and there's nobody can stop death.
No.
And
how much land have you got altogether?
You mean when I farm or own?
That you own and farm and so on.
Oh, my Lord, Bernice. Probably around 5,000 acres, own land and rent. And my dad gave one of my sisters a section of land, and Ralph Thornton lives here in town. He farmed it. Larry Thornton sells cars for Al Norman up here, mm-hmm. and they farm a section of it. Mm-hmm. But I farm a sister's land, and I still run a lot of cattle.
You just had the one sister?
Two. My youngest sister died, and she was choir director down here in the Methodist Church. Doris Thornton. She was the choir director down here in the Methodist Church for a long while here in Woodward. Mm-hmm. And my other sister, they're the banker at Minko, Oklahoma. They're in the banking business.
I see. I was going to ask you about the, and I've been trying to think of their name. Who is it that lives West May on that south side? McClung.
McClung, yeah.
I was going to ask you something about the McClungs.
They must have tell you. The old lady, she had a husband, Warwick. He was quite a feller. He liked the bottle awful well. But she inherited some money. I don't know how much.
Who was she before she married?
I don't know what her name was. Mm-hmm. I never did know. But Henry, she inherited this money, and they put it in land. Mm-hmm. She had two boys. P.L., did you know him?
I know Bob.
Well, that was Bob. Henry was Bob's dad.
Oh.
And the old lady had two boys, P.L. and Henry. But PL never did do too well, and the old lady, she kept a stand with Henry, and she backed him up, and of course Henry, he...
I heard you say you were glad you were with Eisenhower.
Yes, sir.
Why?
Because Eisenhower, at that time, was the head of the whole thing. You had Omar Bradley, and I forget the other 5 men. I know them well. But Eisenhower was the head of the whole thing. He was the guy. Now, Blood and Guts Patton, he was about way down in 4th Command, way down there, and he thought he was going to gain something, but he didn't gain nothing. Now, I stood one time, I was 6 weeks on guard. I was sergeant of guards in a place in England called Stow on the Wall. And on top of this hill was a big radio station. It was a big outfit, and we had 5 men all the time, and I was sergeant of the guard. 5 men all the time of live ammunition in the rifles, a guard in this place. They was radioing all of the commands over to this, and that's where England, that's where our men was getting their orders from, was from United States to Washington, D.C. That's where Eisenhower was over there when they made the invasion. Him and, I forget, 2 or 3 generals there. But that was exactly where they was getting all of their orders, was coming through that radio station.
From Washington,
Yes,
D.C.?
sir, I know what I'm talking about. And they said, don't let anybody in that place. If you do use that gun, that's what you got it for. And there was nobody come around it.
Mm-hmm.
And them old boys, they was combed pretty close to took care of it.
Mm-hmm.
We had one boy named Sandal, and he's from someplace here in Oklahoma. And he was one of the chief operators there. And he said, I'm telling you, boy, I knew all the time what was taking place and what was going to take place, because he said they was sending right down, all the big boys to get them.
Well, who was, from Washington, D.C., who was sending the orders? Was
Why, your commanding, the president was over there, and some of the big generals, they was sitting over there figuring this out along, but here was Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, and I forget the other general, they was already over here. Eisenhower and them guys, they'd already formed this invasion. Mm-hmm. They would know how it was going to be. And they knew that it was going to be a rough situation. And they said Eisenhower and them fellows were right out where they could see it. They wanted to watch it. And they was on a boat there someplace, but I don't know where it was. But they was there and watched it. And I guess they was really thrilled when they seen them old Yanks going up over that hill. And I would like for you, if you ever go to St. Mary Gallice, I want you to go out and look at that beautiful cemetery. Just row of crosses and crosses and crosses and crosses. And I've done been by it. And I watched them bury truckloads after truckload of men. They put them in a mattress cover. They took the dog tags away from their neck, kept one in their mouth, sent the other one back to Washington, tied the mattress cover up over their head, and laid them in there, and put their stone up. And they're buried there. Thousands of them.
But there's only one to the grave.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
But they just made the graves with a cat tractor. They just,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the way we had to bury all them dead at Nordhausen prison camp. We just went out behind and made the Germans carry them out there and get out in there. You bury them. You, the guy that killed them, now you bury them. And they just laid them down in there in that long trench, and we covered them up. A lot of boys kind of resented it. I didn't resent, Bernice, I didn't resent nothing. I was no better than any other boy that ever walked in United States soil. I was no better than any other one. And why should I resent going over? It was my country. And you give old Hitler time, he would have tried to been here.
Oh, yeah.
So I didn't resent it. Some of them said, I've even had fellows tell me, you didn't have no business over there. Well, if I didn't, why'd they send me over? But I'm not a complainer. I went over, I learned a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Fact of the matter, I learned how the Army navigated.
Mm-hmm.
You have no idea what it would cost. Nobody else have any idea what it would cost to run an army like the United States had. You don't even, what it cost is the grub that was caught. And when we landed, when we got on shore, they was bringing in 5-gallon cans of gasoline all by the shiploads, keeping them old big trucks and them old big tanks rolling, and they was coming in with grub and everything else you could think of. And here they had to set up laundries, all that, and they had to set up taking baths and all that. Oh, nobody will ever understand what it took to move that United States Army. Millions of dollars that wouldn't even be a drop in the bucket. No.
And things are so much more expensive today
Oh.
than they were then.
If the next one lasts, it won't last long. Oh, it won't last long.
No.
But what I got the kick out of one time, we was running signal wire, trying to keep up with the infantry. And they said the Germans was off down and coming across here. And here come 2 of our big old Sherman tanks right in. I didn't see them, they was right on us. Bernice picked up 5 of my telephone wires, and they just wrapped them around and just kept on and going. When they broke, why, that was all. I had to go back and put in my telephone wire.
Oh.
Old Bartlett and Tetloff stand up in that truck. Hey, folks, there goes your telephone wires down there.
Mm-hmm. Well, then you weren't actually in the fight, the worst fight.
No, I was. At times, I was right behind the infantry.
Mm-hmm.
And the infantry was riding on the tanks trying to keep up, and we was right behind the tanks.
Mm-hmm.
But do you ever hear of Dalrymple used to live over there north of Shattuck?
I've heard of them, yes.
He was down one day just ahead of me off down on a pole, and we was tying a crossover to go there. Pow! And an old bullet comes sailing over, and old Dalrymple said, "Do you hear that so-and-so shooting at me?" I said, "Get down off of that pole, you bat." And it wasn't but about just a second or two, round come a sergeant in a pickup and a Jeep. "Get down off of there," he said, "there's a German tank coming right back there." I'm telling you, Miss Jackson, there was about, went down a pole any faster than I did. I unhooked the belt and I went down that faster than I ever did in my life. I might have burnt the pole a little bit, but I'm telling you, I went down her. God, I was scared.
Yes.
But what tickled me, we didn't get but around. But here come 2 of Uncle Sam's tanks, and that ended it. That wound it up.
Mm-hmm. That ended the German tank.
Yeah, we stopped it. Well, Bernice, we